Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. In this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Dr. Yael Ziegler, who is Rosh Beit Midrash and academic director of Matan and teaches Tanakh at Herzog College. And we will be discussing her book on Megillas Rus, which is entitled Ruth, From Alienation to Monarchy, and published by Magid, which is an imprint of Koren Publishers. So thank you, Dr. Ziegler, for joining me once again.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so let's start off. Obviously, we discussed about yourself on our previous podcast about Eicha. So let's start off about with Rus. Why did you decide? This was your first big book. Eicha was the second one. Why did you decide to write a book on Rus?
Well, I had been teaching Megillat Rut for many years, and some of the things that I liked about Rut and that I felt were important enough to write a book about it is that, well, first of all, it's the meeting place for many Tanakh ideas, for many Tanakh stories. It enabled me also to have this sort of methodological opportunity to do a lot of intertextual readings to show the meeting place between Ruth and Sefer Shoftim, between Ruth and Sefer Shmuel, right? Ruth, of course, lays the groundwork for Melucha, for kingship. And also, of course, many of the connections between Ruth and Sefer Bereshit, whether it's Ruth and the story of Avram and Lot, or Ruth and the story of Yehuda and Tamar. But also, I'll say one other thing, which is that it's a great story. It's sort of seems at first glance like an ordinary story, right? A sweet story, which I think has a lot of compelling messages that can be appreciated by different people, different ages, different, levels of learning, and also ultimately contains messages for how to build a well-functioning society, which I think are some very relevant messages today, especially in the way that Ruth kind of contrasts Sefer Shoftim. Sefer Shoftim tells us about how a society disintegrates, and then Megillat Rut gives us the formula for building a society that functions well.
Right, and we'll pick up more on that, the parallel between Shoftim. I think it's something you discuss at length in the beginning of the book, and it's really fascinating. So let's first talk about just a general question about the book, and perhaps we discussed this on the previous podcast episode. We did, I don't remember. But are there what styles and methods that you employ and how you use them throughout this book?
Yeah. So, what I'm doing in the book is essentially what I think the Midrash does, which is to use the methodology of, close readings, noting words, noting syntax, noting parallels between the different stories, different books, different characters, and seeing if I can mine those different discoveries and different things that you see in order to pull out of the book some deeper messages and to understand what is the book trying to accomplish in the broader picture of Tanakh.
Right, and I think, as you note, right, Rus has this concise 4-part structure. It's more of a concise, it's like a beginning, middle, end, as opposed to like other Megillas.
Yeah, well, Megillat Rut is also taught actually in universities as the perfect short story, right? I think one of the reasons it's the perfect short story is because of what you said. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And also because it's very well structured, both in terms of the language and the actual structure of the 4 chapters. So if chapter 1, if Perek Aleph sets out the problem in the book, the problem, of course, is the loss of Naomi's family, the loss of the future for Naomi's family. By chapter 4, we see that everything that has been taken away is basically restored. In chapters 2 and 3, Perek Bet and Perek Gimel, show us how that's done in this kind of 2-part, very, very neat structure where Perek Bet shows us the solution for Naomi's economic trials, right? She is in danger of not having any food. And, Perek Gimel shows us the resolution of long-term survival for Naomi's family. And that is, of course, obtaining a child, right? Making sure that we have continuity. And these Perek Bet and Perek Gimel, which are structured very, very similarly so that they draw attention to the fact that these are two sides of the same coin. Because when you talk about trying to obtain food for immediate survival and trying to obtain children for long-term survival, you're basically talking about Birchat Avraham, the blessing that God gives to Avram, which has been lost by Naomi, right? By Naomi's family. There is not Zerah Haaretz, there's not food, and there's not Zerah Ha'adam, there's not continuity. So Megillat Ruth is this sort of very neat presentation of a problem, a solution, and how we get to that solution. That's kind of the external structure of the book, making it a really readable and a book that kind of makes you feel that all ends have been tied up.
Okay, so what? Let's discuss Ruth. So what is it about, and why? What's the reasons for it being written? I mean, what is it about? I'm sure everyone knows the story, but if you want, you could still say parts of the story. But what meaning? Why was it written? I know you discussed two main reasons for this. But what?
Yeah. So, I think that the very question is worth also discussing, which is, Megillat Ruth, unlike Megillat Esther, is not a very dramatic book, right? As you know, the fate of Am Yisrael does not hang in the balance here, right? It seems to be a nice book about nice people doing nice things for each other. And, there's something about it that does lend itself to the question, which Chazal do ask, which is, why was it written, right? And Chazal provide two answers. The more famous answer is, Lilomdecha kama sachar tov legomlei chasadim, to teach us the great reward for those who do kindness. And the perhaps less well-known, but also well-known answer is that it lays the groundwork for the Davidic dynasty. Of course, Megillat Ruth takes us to David HaMelech. Now, I would say that the first answer always a little bit troubled me. This idea that we have a whole book to teach us about chesed seemed to me to be a little bit it seemed a little extraneous. I mean, we can learn chesed from Avram, we can learn chesed from Rivka, we can actually learn chesed from God, right? The idea of God who is, oseh chesed la'alafim, and we have this concept of, imitatio Dei, right? Halachta bidrachav. We know that we're supposed to do chesed. Why do we need a whole book to teach us to do chesed? And moreover, I'll say two more things. One is that midrash seems to say not that it teaches us to do chesed, but how great is the reward for one who does chesed, which is rather a strange formulation. And the other thing, I think this is the most perplexing thing about this answer, is that the sort of chesed that I guess especially Ruth, but I would include Boaz in this as well, but that Ruth is doing in Megillat Ruth is a sort of a unique kind of chesed, a chesed of almost self-sacrifice, right? Everything that Ruth seems to do in order to do chesed seems to involve sacrificing her own needs, her own interests, starting with the fact that she stays with Naomi, even though Naomi tells her, you have no future with me, no one will marry you, there's no one back in Beit Lechem who, can give you a child, you might as well go home to Moab if you want to have a family, and ending with the fact that Ruth essentially at the end of the book relinquishes her child to Naomi and then kind of falls out of the story. So the question that I had when I read that midrash was, what is the midrash really saying when it says that the purpose of Megillat Ruth is to teach us the great reward of chesed? And here's where I think that there is a connecting line between these two midrashim, because it seems to me that really what Chazal are saying about Megillat Ruth is that Megillat Ruth is teaching us the type of chesed that needs to be done in order to build a functional infrastructure of leadership. Leadership, of course, especially kingship, is something that the Tanakh is very conflicted about, right? Remember when in Shmuel, when the people come to Shmuel and ask for a king, and Shmuel becomes enraged, and God becomes enraged and says, no, Shmuel, it's not you they're rejecting, it's me they're rejecting. And there seems to be a real tension that revolves around the question of milucha, of kingship. And I think that one of the things that the Tanakh is responding to is the fact that kingship has been, and always will be dangerous, right? power is dangerous. Leadership is dangerous. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And therefore, I think what Megillat Ruth is trying to sort of guide us towards is a certain type of chesed that maybe not the usual sort of chesed that we are all required to do, but chesed that is absolutely essential for our leaders. And it's the kind of chesed which, like the chesed that Ruth does, is self-nullifying, right? We have this like sort of remarkable phenomenon in Parak Gimel, which my brother once pointed out to me, my brother, Dr. Mordechai Ziegler, who lives in Baltimore. So he once pointed out to me that if you look in Ruth Parak Gimel, you have a Masoretic phenomenon. There's the Balei Mesorah put a Kri V'lo Chtiv twice in Parak Gimel. And the Kri V'lo Chtiv is the word Elai, right? It appears outside of, in your Tanakh, it appears outside of the pasuk. And of course, if you're reading from the Klaf, from the Megillah, you just have a blank there. And what my brother suggested is that in both of these instances, Ruth is speaking about herself, but she takes the Elai out of the sentence. And that really gives you a sense of who Ruth is. Who is Ruth? Ruth is the one who can say, it's not about me. If you give me food, I give it to Naomi. If you give me a child, I give it to Naomi. And imagine if the king had that kind of attitude. He has all the power concentrated in his hands. If you give him the power over the judiciary, the power over the treasury, the power over the military, but he doesn't see it as being for himself, but rather he sees himself as some kind of empty vessel that is giving it over to the people, you have yourself a wonderful formula for kingship that will not become an exercise in tyranny, in corruption, in debauchery. I just want to make one more point. I know I've been talking for a long time, but the other point that my brother pointed out, which I think was really a wonderful idea, which I put in my book, and I actually gave him credit for it, which is that when the Midrash is doing etymologies of the different names in Ruth, so the Midrash wreaks havoc with Elimelech's etymology, right? And Elimelech, why did Elimelech, Naomi's husband, why was he named Elimelech? Clearly because his mother wanted to say, my God is king, Elimelech. But what does the Midrash say? The Midrash says, Elimelech used to walk around saying, Elai tavo hamalchut, to me shall come the kingship. And what is really extraordinary here, which my brother pointed out, is that what is the Midrash saying? Ruth deserves kingship because she knows how to take the Elai out of her sentences. And Elimelech is unqualified for kingship because he walks around saying, the kingship is for me, Eli, right? Which I think is really a nice indication of how, once you kind of dig deeply into the Midrashim, you really see, what they're really trying to say.
Right, now picking up a little bit deeper on what you were saying. So, you discuss this in the book that the roots of Rus really are this chesed is Lot and Avram, which is really what's going on over here with Rus and then eventually with Boaz.
Yeah. Well, it seems pretty clear that Ruth is being regarded here as an Avram-like figure, right? When Boaz meets her in the field and he's nice to her and she falls on her face in amazement and says, Madua matzati chin beinecha lakireni v'anochi nochriya, right? Why have I found favor in your eyes? I'm a stranger. And he says to her, he makes this wonderful speech. He says, hugadli kol asher asit et chamotech, it has surely been told to me everything that you did with your mother-in-law, achrei mot ishech, after your husband died. Vata'azvi avich ve'imech ve'eretz moladtech v'telchi el am asher lo yadat tmol shel shom. Right, you left your father, your mother, your birthplace, and I see you smiling because you, as I'm sure many of the listeners, are hearing echoes of God's first words to Avram. Lech lecha me'artzecha u'mimoladcha u'mibeit avicha el haaretz asher areka, right? Go out from your father's house. So we have this I think really what Boaz's statement to Ruth is meant to be is, you are Avram-like. You are Avram-like because you're a giver of food. You are Avram-like because you're a giver of loyalty. You're Avram-like because you assume responsibility for the other. And therefore, Ruth becomes the one who can kind of guide Am Yisrael back to the path of Avram during a very difficult period of the Shoftim, a period in which they seem to have strayed from Avram's path, the path of Chesed, and instead, where do we wind up at the end of Sefer Shoftim? We wind up in a Sdom and Amorah story. We wind up with the story of the concubine in Giv'ah, where, finally she and her husband are taken into the house of one kind man who's not a local, right? And then the people get wind of it. The people of Giv'ah get wind of the fact that somebody hosted these guests, and they surround the house and they demand to rape the guests. And it's this Sdom and Amorah-like story, which really, I think, it should strike us as both being horrific, because it means that Am Yisrael has become Kistom Hayinu La Amorah Daminu, in the words of Yeshayahu, right? We're like Sdom and Amorah, which suggests that we no longer have the right to exist. But at the same time, also it suggests that in leaving Avram's path, Am Yisrael finds itself in Lot's path. Right? They kind of find themselves in a place which is the antithesis of Avram. There's I think another kind of wonderful linguistic moment that makes this point, that really drives this point home, which is that when Lot leaves Avram, and Avram tells him to leave, right? Avram says to him, "Hipare na me'alai," right? Im hayamin va'asma'ila v'masmol ve'emina, right? Separate yourself from me. You go left, I'll go right. You go right, I'll go left, right? And of course, that's because their shepherds have been fighting, and we're told Lot doesn't go either right or left, as the Sforno points out. He doesn't listen to Avram. Instead, he goes straight ahead to Sdom and Amorah, which is a place where Anshe Sdom Ra'im v'Chataim LaHashem Me'od, they are very evil. And he goes there, and of course he encounters a city which is the antithesis of Avram. And, we kind of find Am Yisrael straying in that direction during the period of the Shoftim. And Ruth, who is a Moabite, who is from the descendants of Lot, she makes her way back to Avram's path. And in fact, when she says to Naomi, "I'm not leaving you," and she takes that great oath of loyalty to Naomi, "El asher telchi elech, uvasher talini alin, amech ami, ve'elokai elokai," right? Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lie, I will lie. Your people is my people. Your God is my God. She ends it with an oath. And the oath is, Ko yaseh Hashem li v'cho yosif, ki hamavet yafrid beini uveinech. Only death will separate us. And it's the same word that is used to describe Lot separating from Abraham. He pare na me'alai, right? Vayipardu ish me'al achiv. They separated. So we have this kind of much broader story in which Ruth it kind of becomes the closure for the story, which begins with Lot leaving Abraham and, producing Moab on the backdrop of this very bad choice. And Ruth makes the opposite choice and comes back to the Avram path.
Now, I want to emphasize what you just said there. Part of what you said, you talked about the parallel to Shoftim. Maybe emphasize that a little bit more. Why is Rus not part of Shoftim? It really is part of Shoftim. By Hibi Meishvai the Shoftim, talking about Shoftim. That's what's going on. So this is something that you emphasize very strongly in the book, and you kind of mentioned a bunch of it. But why is it not in Shoftim?
Yeah, so that's a really important question. That question, of course, becomes strengthened by our tradition, our Masorah in Bava Batra, which is that Shmuel wrote both of these books, right? So even more so, you want to ask yourself, if Shmuel wrote both these books, so why didn't he put Ruth into Sefer Shoftim. It does take place, as you said, at the same time period. But I think that the minute that that we understand the goal of these books, you understand why it's not in Sefer Shoftim. And I think you can really kind of simplify this idea with one very important observation, which is that the Megillat Ruth, Sefer Shoftim is the story of a society that disintegrates and really kind of spirals into a situation of religious and social disintegration. And the final pasuk of Sefer Shoftim is Bayamim hahem Ein melech b'Yisrael, ish hayashar beinav yaseh. In those days, there's no king of Israel, and therefore everyone does whatever they want to do. And of course, that's chaos, right? Tohu vavohu. They're behaving terribly in terms of their social behavior, in terms of their religious behavior. There's idolatry, pesel micha. There's this, there's this terrible story of the rape of the concubine in Giv'ah, and then there's civil war. But look at how Megillat Ruth ends. What are the last words of Megillat Ruth? V'yishai holid et David. In other words, Yesh melech b'Yisrael. There is a king in Israel. So all of Megillat Ruth is leading us away from the unraveling of Sefer Shoftim. And I think really, the simplest kind of like idea of this book is, what is the purpose of Megillat Ruth? The purpose of Megillat Ruth is to teach us how to emerge from the terrible mire in which we find ourselves at the end of Sefer Shoftim. I'll just mention, an example, which I think is a really powerful example, which is that Sefer Shoftim, kind of moves us to, throughout Sefer Shoftim, there's no chesed. Right? The word chesed appears only twice in all of the book, once in the negative, lo asu chesed, and once in a military context. And Megillat Ruth is filled with chesed. Sefer Shoftim is a book in which people are not giving food to each other. Think of the story of Gideon asking the people of Sukkot and Penuel to give food to his troops. And, and he's met with a very kind of almost cynical refusal. Sefer Shoftim, and here's I think a really kind of interesting omission. Sefer Shoftim never has the word Geula, never has the word Gaal. Right now, okay, I don't know why we would necessarily expect it in Sefer Shoftim, but I want to say something about the word Geula, which is that the word Geula in the Torah almost always is used in the context of not what God does for Am Yisrael, like we're accustomed, in our colloquial usage of Geula or in the prophetic usage of Geula, but in the Torah, and especially in Parshat Behar, in Vayikra Kaf Hey, the word Gaal is used in the context of taking social responsibility for the other. There is no Geula in Sefer Shoftim. Well, you know what we have in Ruth? We have a book of chesed. The word chesed appears over and over, and people are giving food. Certainly Boaz gives Ruth food, and Ruth gives Naomi food. And the word Gaal, you know how many times it appears in Megillat Ruth? 23 times in 4 chapters. And it's all about human beings, or really primarily Boaz, taking responsibility for their, for their relatives, for their family, for each other. And so, it winds up that Megillat Ruth teaches us how the assumption of social responsibility is the way to, build a community, to build a well-functioning society. Whereas the minute that we begin to lose our sense of loyalty, of kindness, of compassion, of social responsibility, things begin to spiral out of control. And, I'll make one final point with regard to this, because this is a critical point, which is that Sefer Shoftim, this is the point actually that relates to the title of my book, From Alienation to Monarchy, which is that Sefer Shoftim ends with these 5 chapters of anonymous figures, people who are unnamed, right? That we have this concubine and her husband and her father and the nice man from Ephraim who takes them in. And then we have, the people of Binyamin and the Ziknei Ha'edah, the elders. Nobody gets a name. right? And what is a society in which nobody gets a name? I mean, it's only a few weeks ago that we commemorated Yom HaShoah. We know what it means to take away people's names and substitute it for numbers. It means that we have people who don't see each other as human beings. They see each other as objects. And that's why they can do these terrible things that they do at the end of Sefer Shoftim. And that's why they can refuse to give food to each other and refuse to be kind to each other, because they don't actually see each other as human beings. While Megillat Ruth is ostensibly about restoring names. The whole goal of Megillat Ruth is lahakim shem hamet al nachalato, to give back names. And Megillat Ruth ends with names, right? Ele toldot Paretz holida Chetzron holida Ram, etc., right? So we have these really opposite movements. Sefer Shoftim takes us to a period of alienation, and Megillat Ruth takes us to a period of monarchy. And all of that is built on these rather unremarkable social interactions, which become remarkable only when we see how critical they are for building a well-functioning society.
Now, we do it start, like you said, it talk Rus is with names, and we start off with names. However, we'll talk about the cast of characters, but when it starts off with the names, 3 of those names are still Shoftim-like. When you have, to some extent, you can discuss them. At least we'll start off with them, with Elimelech, Machlon, and Kilian.
Yeah. I mean, you're picking up, I think, on a really important point that I didn't say before, but is absolutely true, which is that all of the background characters of Megillat Ruth are Shoftim-like characters, which makes the actions of Ruth and Boaz all the more remarkable. They're not acting that way because they live in this little bubble of the period of the Shoftim. They're acting that way because they are really remarkable individuals who act against the general kind of trajectory of society. Again, when I think of Megillat Ruth, and I've had, thank God, the opportunity to teach Megillat Ruth to all sorts of ages and kihilot. And one of the things that I find is that you can teach Megillat Ruth to really young people. And the messages are really so clear and simple. And one of the messages is the power of the individual to change society, right? So we have, because really, you're absolutely right. Elimelech, Machlon, Chilion, they're part of the problem of Sefer Shoftim. That's why they have these names. They're part of what is really going to be cut off, or what and even just look at their first act. What's their first act? They go to Moab during a famine. Now, Chazal, the Midrashim, I think many people are aware, are excessively harsh with them, right? Chazal really, they say terrible things about them. They say, oh, yes, they had lots of food in their house, and the people came, or they had lots of money, and the people came and surrounded their house, zebekupato, v'zebekupato, right? Each one with their tzedakah box. And when they look out of the window and see all those needy people, they put all of their property on their donkeys, and they go hightailing it off for Moab. Well, where do Chazal get that? And by the way, note that it's an inverted Pilegish Begivah story, right? With the bad people inside and the good people outside in this case. But that, what's really interesting to me, I thought a lot about these Midrashim, because what's really interesting to me is, why are they so harsh, the Midrashim, with Elimelech, Machlon, and Kilion? Where do they get this idea that the family had food that they were hiding? And I think that the answer lies in their destination. Where do they go? Where do people usually go during a drought, during a famine? They go to Egypt. Now, this family goes to Moab, and we know that Moab is not exactly known for being generous with their food, right? Why are we not allowed to marry Moabites, according to Devarim Perek Gimel? Al devar asher lo kidmu etchem belechem u'v'mayim b'derech b'tzeitchem mimitzrayim, because they didn't give us food and water. So one of the things that Chazal are saying, I think, is if this family is going to Moab during a famine, they have food. They're not depending on Moab to give them food. And perhaps even more significantly, they're going to Moab because they identify with Moab. They're Moab-like. And what is Moab like? Sodom and Amorah like. So these Judean leaders, these, people from Yehudah are basically Shoftim people. Shoftim winds up in Sodom and Amorah. And where do the Judean leaders go? To Moab, who are the spiritual heirs of Sodom and Amorah, right? So they really are what you're saying, about this sort of Shoftim-like cast of characters who have these, certainly Machlon and Chilion seem to have these problematic names, which, seem to allude to their end. It seems they seem to be a mirror of Am Yisrael during the period of the Shoftim. And I would say the same is true about many of the minor characters that we find in the book. You look at the women of Beit Lechem, when Naomi comes back and they see her, they say, Hazot Naomi, and then they don't give her anything. They don't give her food. They don't even ask about Ruth. They're completely uninterested in who is with her. Think of Ploni Almoni, who doesn't have a name. Why doesn't he have a name, right? He doesn't have a name because he refuses to assume social responsibility. He's part of the problem, the alienated society, the society with no names, right? And this is really, I think, the general cast of characters in Megillat Rut are very Shoftim-like characters, including, by the way, the reapers in the field. Every year on Shavuot, assuming I'm awake when they're reading Sefer Rut, which I try to be, but every single year when we read Boaz's words to Rut, when he's speaking to her in the field, and he says to her, Halo tziviti et hane'arim levilti nog'ech, I commanded the reapers, the boys, not to touch you. I get goosebumps. I said, what do you mean? You have to command the reapers in the field of Beit Lechem not to abuse Ruth, not to harass her? It's indicative of a society which has spiraled out of control. It's not a morally functioning society. It's not a society that's functioning in the way that Am Yisrael is supposed to function. So Ruth and Boaz are the exception in Megillat Rut, and they really turn around the trajectory of society.
Now we get to one of the big characters in the book, and one of the enigmatic in some ways is Nami. I mean, and you have a half a page here when you start off Nami in the book, and you wrote, who is Nami? Is she an active party to the decision to abandon Beis Lechem during the famine, or is she an adjunct of her husband? How should we understand Nami's eventual decision to return to Beis Lechem? Is she hopeless and suicidal, returning to Beis Lechem in order to die? Or is she cautiously optimistic, returning to Beis Lechem to reconstruct her life? And then you go on, is Nami an empathetic mother-in-law? Is she an emblem of piety, or bitterly angry at Hashem? I mean, all these questions really come up with her in the book. I mean, so I'll let you discuss. I mean, who is she?
Yeah, it's a really hard one. And your word enigmatic, I think, is really the right word. By the way, we may emphasize certain midrashim more than others, but I will say that the midrashim are conflicted about Naomi. The jury is out on Naomi in the text, but also in the midrashic readings of Naomi. When I worked on this, I found Naomi to be the most enigmatic figure. What I proposed in my book is that Naomi is a reflection of the people during the period of the Shoftim. And that, ultimately she's the main character in the book, right? In a sense, because Megillat Rut is about Am Yisrael. It's not about this one family. It's about how, by turning around the trajectory of Naomi's life, we also can turn around the trajectory of Am Yisrael's life. So Naomi kind of gets pulled to Moab, just like Am Yisrael kind of, go with the flow to Sodom and Amorah. And, by the end of the story, Naomi has hope. Naomi has a Goel. Naomi has her name back, right? Remember, she says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, right? And, she seems to have lost hope. She is clearly, I would say even blaming God, right? Yatzavi Yad Hashem, the hand of God, is she feels that God has caused her to become bitter. She says that several times. Well, by the end of the book, the women are blessing her in the name of God. And she she has been restored, right? She comes back to life again. And I think that the goal is to do the same thing for Am Yisrael, that this child who will eventually set up the kingship and will be responsible for setting up a society that works is going to bring names back to not just Naomi's family, but back to the people. So that was what I proposed. But I agree with you that Naomi is the most complex figure in the book.
Now, I don't know, in some ways it's surprising. I think we've made it this far in and we haven't mentioned one of the other figures. I don't think we've mentioned Orpah yet.
Orpah, right? Who, by the way, is definitely a secondary figure. So, we haven't really mentioned Boaz yet either, and I think that he's really important. But I will say something about Orpah, which is that I don't know. I always thought, again, I looked at some of the midrashim, and I felt that the midrashim were very harsh with Orpah. Right? If you look at the midrashim, they are really excessively harsh with her. And some of the midrashim, which describe her not just as cruel, but as very promiscuous, right? There's a whole series of midrashim that describe her promiscuity. And actually, when you read through the text itself, you get the feeling that she kind of does what you would expect people to do. Right? Certainly when you compare her to Ruth and she becomes a kind of a literary foil for Ruth, well, yeah, she comes out wanting. But if you look at her in her own right, Naomi says to her, don't come with me. You have no future with me. You have no possibility of having a family or having children. So, go back to Moab. And she cries and she says, no, I want to be with you. I want to stay with you. And she seems utterly sincere and no different than Ruth. And then, of course, in the moment of truth, she does choose to go back and start her own family, which I don't know. On some level seems like a very reasonable and even moral decision. The way that I look at Orpah, certainly in the eyes of Chazal, is as I think Chazal are telling us something about Orpah's choice more than about Orpah the person. What I think Chazal are saying is if you make the Lot choice and you go live in Moab, you're going to wind up being Sodom and Gomorrah. You're going to wind up cruel and promiscuous because that society is cruel and promiscuous. If you look at Chazal's depiction of Ruth, it is the diametrical opposite of Orpah. Ruth is the emblem of kindness and also of what Chazal always say about Ruth. She is the sanua, right? She is the modest one. And I think Chazal are commenting not necessarily on something that Ruth is doing in the story, certainly in terms of her modesty, but more on the choice that she makes to leave Moab behind and come to to walk on the path of Avraham. I think that is Chazal's point, rather than to see these midrashim as maligning Orpah personally, which is not really indicated in the story itself.
Okay, and I know you mentioned we have to talk about Boaz, but before we get to him, we really should talk a little bit more about Rus. I know in the book you mentioned Rus. I think the title of the chapter is Love and Devotion, how her devotion to Naomi and her love for Hashem, for God. So talk a little bit more about Rus specifically.
Yeah. It's hard not to talk about Ruth because she is, first of all, she's the eponymous heroine, right? The story is named after her. And so we're immediately drawn to her. And, we did a little bit talk about her before as this embodiment of Avram-like values. We also spoke about the fact that she is an emblem of a certain kind of chesed, right? A chesed, which is one that we very much expect from our leaders. And so she becomes the mother of kingship. One thing that we didn't talk very much about is, her loyalty to God, her ahavat Hashem, which is not so pronounced, but is latently present. There's one of the questions that I think we do ask is, why did she stay with Naomi? So certainly the loyalty, her fidelity to Naomi is unquestionable, right? But at the same time, Chazal tend to learn from Ruth what is real dveikut, right? Or dveikus, right? There's, this idea that that particular word, Ruth davkaba, Ruth cleaves to Naomi. And that word is usually used or often used about what we are meant to do towards God, right? So you can sort of extrapolate from Ruth's behavior, the kind of unwavering loyalty and devotion that we're meant to have to God, even when it's illogical, even when it doesn't seem to be something that's in our immediate best interest. The two places I would say, though, where we do see Ruth's love for Naomi and love for God as being somewhat equated is, first of all, in her oath, right, where she says, Amech ami ve'elokaich Elokai, right? She, of course, specifically notes that she wants to remain not just with Naomi, but part of Naomi's nation and part of Naomi's service of God. And Boaz seems to recognize this, because Boaz, when he pronounces her great, her great milas, right? All of her great attributes. So he says, we started mentioning it before, right? Everything that you did. And then he says to her, Yeshalem Hashem poalech, God should repay you for your deeds. Utihi maskortech shlema me'im Hashem Elokei Israel asher bat lachasot tachat knafav, right? Your reward should be full from God, who you came in order to dwell under God's wings. It's a beautiful formulation, and it indicates that even Boaz understands that Ruth's loyalty to Naomi is also somehow interwoven in her love for God, in her desire to be part of serving God as part of Am Yisrael.
So now we get to Boaz, and we did mention Boaz before a little bit when he and this is something more we'll emphasize, his kindness especially.
Yeah. So I'll say something about Boaz, because really I think Boaz is kind of the I would say the prime mover in the story, but as we all know, and the Rambam says, God is the prime mover. So, and in the story, God is the prime mover. Actually, the God only appears actively twice in the story. Right? All the time people are mentioning God. It's a book that's filled with mentions of God, but God himself only appears twice in the story. One is in the very beginning to give the people food, and the second is at the very end to give a child. And again, it's Birchat Avram. It's Zerah Haaretz and Zerah Ha'adam. God is the one who gives food. God is, remember we talked about the three keys, right? At the in Masechet Ta'anit, right? God has three keys: the keys of rain, the keys of childbirth. So God gives both food and children, but then Boaz becomes the recipient, who then can give over God's blessing, right? So Boaz is really the one who kind of sets into motion the solution in the story. Boaz gives these things to Ruth. He gives Ruth food. He gives Ruth a child, and Ruth gives it to Naomi, right? But I think that the real question when we get to Boaz is why is he so different, right? It's, everybody around him is behaving in really abominable ways. I mean, really terrible behavior, both in Sefer Shoftim and in Megillat Rut. They're not behaving properly in terms of their moral conduct. They're not behaving properly in terms of their treatment of the other. And here's Boaz, who is, just really kind of plodding along, doing the right thing while everybody around him is not, and extraordinary acts of kindness. So what enables Boaz to be all these things and to do all these things? So I think that the idea of Boaz is that, Boaz retains his name, right? He is introduced with the words, Ushmo Boaz, right? His name is Boaz. And I think that the reason that Boaz retains his name is because he sees the other, right? When he first arrives in the field and he sees Ruth, right? He says, Lemi hanara hazot. Who is that girl? And, there's a Gemara in Shabbos, on Daf Kuf Yud Gimel, where the Gemara asks the question, V'chidar koshel Boaz lish'ol achar hanashim? Is that Boaz's way? He comes into the field and he asks about the girls. What kind of question is that, right? So the Gemara says, well, Devar Chochma Ra'aba, Devar Tzniut Ra'aba. He saw that she was very wise and very knowledgeable about halacha. He saw that she was very modest. But I would kind of reframe the question. To me, the question is not why Boaz asks about her. It's why nobody else does. You see, Boaz's question is really the continuation of the women's question previously, right? Previously, the women said, Hazot Naomi. And what didn't they say? Ulemi hanara hazot. Who is this girl? Now Boaz comes in, and the first thing he sees is this young woman who is picking like a pauper in the fields, and he wants to understand what has reduced her to this kind of desperate situation. And he turns to her, and right away he begins to speak to her. And she says to him, Madua matzati chen be'enecha lehakireni. What is she most appreciative of? She's most appreciative that he has recognized her. And to understand how unusual this is, we have to understand that that word lahakir appears 3 times in Megillat Rut. Once is when Ruth says, I can't believe it. Like, why have you recognized me? And the other is when she comes back with an armful of grain, and Naomi says to her, Eifo likatatayon ve'ana asit yehi makirech Baruch, let the one who recognized you be blessed. Then all of this is because in Parak Gimel, we learn that this is a period, I'm kind of paraphrasing it, I'm doing kind of a midrashic reading, but B'terem yakir ish et re'ehu. Sefer Shoftim is a period in which people are no longer recognizing each other. They're not seeing each other as people. They're not seeing, with their own eyes that there's a person standing in front of them, not an object. And therefore, I think one of the most remarkable moments in the book, and again, there are these sort of extraordinary lessons in these ordinary moments, is when Ruth has come down to Boaz on the threshing floor in the middle of the night in this very, very difficult scenario, which I know, everybody's sort of perplexed by this scenario of Parak Gimel. And, it seems to be a very kind of, laden, weighty scenario, which is very suggestive. And, then we have this pasuk, which tells us, Vayhi b'chatzi halayla, it was at the midpoint of the night, Vayecherad ha'ish Vayilafet, v'hinei isha shochevet margelotav. Right, he wakes up in the middle of the night and he sees a woman lying next to his feet. And what's interesting about that pasuk is that it's not Ruth and Boaz; it's an ish and an isha. It's a man and a woman, no names, right? And the moment seems ripe for for things to go in a certain direction. And Chazal are very aware of this, right? Chazal tell us, Kol oto halayla haya yitzro shel Boaz mekatrigo ve'omer ata panoi umevakesh isha v'hi pruya umevakeshet ish amod uvoala v'savea liyitzrecha. Right? He says that whole night Boaz is kind of ardor was, hammering away at him, saying, you're single and you're looking for a woman. She's single. She's looking for a man, maybe just sleep with her. And that's where the scenario seems to be going. But the turning point of the book is when Boaz wakes up, he sees a woman lying by his feet. And you know what he does? He says 2 words, Vayomer mi'at. Who are you? Right? He turns her from object to subject. And that's not just the turning point of Megillat Rut. That's the turning point for Sefer Shoftim. When you can look at somebody and see beyond their objectness, what they can do for you, right? But you see them as human beings. That's when you treat them properly. That's when society begins to come together as a healthy, well-functioning, moral society.
So that's basically the third parak. You ready? That's what I was going to ask you. So you got it, which is good. But then we get to the last one. Now we get this kind of interesting with plenty of money with no name. We get the chalitza and the yibum. What's going on with that?
Yeah, that's it. It's, look, Ploni Almoni is, as we said before, he's part of the problem. That's why he doesn't get a name, because he doesn't assume social responsibility. But I think you really are asking here about, what is the Yibum story here, right? That's what you're asking. You're saying Daf Yomi is doing Yevamos now, right? So that's, I guess, on everybody's mind. And what's interesting about Megillat Rut is that Megillat Rut is filled with Yibum-like words and phrases, right? I mean, the actual word Yibum, it really only appears in 3 places in Tanakh. One is in the story of Yehuda and Tamar. The other one is in the mitzvah of Yibum in Devarim Kafeh. And the third is in Ruth Parak Aleph, when Orpah is referred to twice as Yivim Teich, which really means the other woman who could get Yibum, right? And lots of other phrases like the phrase Eshet Hamet only appears in these in Megillat Ruth and in a Yibum-like context. The words imlo yachpotz, right? When Boaz says to Ruth on the threshing floor, lini halayla v'hayav haboker im yigalech tov yigal v'imlo yachpotz l'galech, if he does not desire to redeem you, and those same words appear with chalitza. Of course, we have somehow in Perek Daled the role of the shoe, right? The na'al, and lots of other phrases like lahakim shem hamet, right? Below yikaret shem hamet, so that we shouldn't erase the name of the dead person. V'ikaresh shmo b'Yisrael, right? There are all these phrases that hark back to Devarim Perek Kafeh, which is the only place where we have the mitzvah of Yibum. So it makes us kind of feel like there's a Yibum story going on here. But our Mefarshim and Midrashim, almost without exception, I say almost without exception because there's one maybe Targum that seems to go a bit in a different direction, but in general, our Midrashim and Mefarshim are very clear that this is not Yibum. Now, Ibn Ezra is extremely insistent on this point because, as he says, this was a point of contention between the Karaites and Jewish tradition and our Jewish tradition, where we know that one of the problems with Yibum is that Yibum holds 2 contradictory principles. One is that you can never marry your brother's wife, and the other is, well, in case where the brother dies without children, then you must marry your brother's wife. So those are 2 kind of contradictions. So we believe that Yibum overrides the usual arayot of the brother's wife. The Karaites believe the arayot overrides Yibum, and therefore Yibum is only done with relatives, but not with the actual brother. So this is a point of, and their proof, of course, is Megillat Rut. So this is a point of great sensitivity for the Ibn Ezra, who is contending with this kind of, Karaite approach. And what he says, and what I think is largely accepted, the Ramban says it as well in his commentary on Yehuda and Tamar in Bereshit Perek Lamed Chet, is that this isn't Yibum, but it's a Yibum-like mitzvah. It's called Geula. That's what the Ramban says. And it's designed to bring about Yibum-like results, which is to ensure that the name of the dead person doesn't get erased and that there's some kind of posterity. And also, I would add, that we've also taken care of, certainly this is evident in Megillat Rut, of this kind of vulnerable wife who doesn't have necessarily the economic means of survival. And so, this idea of someone in the family taking responsibility by marrying the wife of someone who is deceased without children is, I think, a very worthy principle. And, in that way, I think we resolve the Yibum-like piece of life. And look, throughout Megillat Rut, there's no indication that this is actually Yibum. I mean, it's not the brother, but aside from it not being the brother, there's no spitting. There's no, there's no, even though they do go up to the gate and there are the elders there, it's not even clear that Ruth is present. And the other thing is that it's clear that Ruth can choose whether or not she has to marry the relative, which is not the case with Yibum. You'd have to do chalitza if you don't desire that. But, Boaz says very explicitly, Heitav chastecha acharon min harishon livilti lechet acharei habachurim im dal ve'im ashir, right? You did a great chesed that you didn't go after the younger men. And, even the fact that Naomi doesn't come straight to Boaz and say, well, you got to find someone to marry Ruth because someone, has to do Yibum, indicates that this is not Yibum. So that's kind of the summary of the Yibum situation.
Okay, then after that, we get the end of the Megillah comes quickly, where Boaz it's a quick happy ending, like we said. Boaz marries her, she gets pregnant, she has a son, and then Naomi gets back involved, and then we read off the genealogy until David HaMelech.
Yeah. I mean, really, the end of the book is, as we said before, it's the restoration of names. That's why I said from Alienation to Monarchy, right? It's not just, Perek Daled. We talked a little bit about the importance of words. Some of the Midrashim are even sensitive to keywords, words that appear over and over. And this is definitely something that, today in academic circles, keywords are, considered to be a clue as to what the story is about. And in Perek Daled, the word shame appears 7 times. Keywords often appear in multiples of 7, right? Like you see in Bereishit Perek Aleph, right? So the word shame appears 7 times in Perek Daled. When Boaz is marrying Ruth, he actually makes this proclamation where he mentions everybody's name. He says, "Kaniti et kol asher Elimelech, et kol asher lechilion umachlon miyad Naomi." Right, in one pasuk, he mentions everybody's name, and then by the time we get to the end of the book, as I mentioned before, we kind of restore names backwards and forwards, right, so that it becomes once again a society which is built on seeing each other's names, and that's the sort of society where where people function. Look, I would also say there's a lot of reversals. I mentioned at the very beginning of our discussion that Perek Aleph is really resolved by Perek Daled. So you see it in so many ways. In Perek Aleph, Naomi says, Gam ha'iti alayla leish v'gam yaladti banim. She says, like, even if I would be with a man tonight and I would have children. She says it in this almost caustic way, right? It's clear to her that she would never have children. But by the end, what do the women say? Yulad ben Naomi, right? Naomi had a child, even though, not literally, but certainly figuratively. And, those same women at the beginning of the story in Perek Aleph, who, kind of like, greeted Naomi, but were absolutely not helpful to Naomi in any way, so that 3 psukim later, after their greeting, we find Naomi alone and starving, and needs to really go and procure her own food. Well, by the end, we have these women who have come back to give blessings to Naomi, b'shem Hashem, Baruch Hashem, Asher lo ishbit lach goel hayom. And Naomi had said, I don't have a name, and now they say v'karei shemo b'Yisrael, right? So there's a real reversal in Perek Daled of all of the things that seem to have been lost in Perek Aleph. And what I think is that this all has bearing on Sefer Shoftim, that Perek Daled is the turnaround that is moving the trajectory of Sefer Shoftim from a place of dysfunction back to the place where Am Yisrael wants to be in fulfilling their goals, our goals as a nation.
Okay. Now, obviously, there's a lot more than to Rus and to your book than we discussed. The book is over 500 pages. So, and I'll put a link in the show's notes that people can purchase it. It's a lot more than we discussed. But just two final questions. First of all, we've discussed a lot of different sources, but what specific sources did you use in this book?
Yeah. So, I'm very interested in, I come from, let's say, 2 worlds, right? I'm academically trained in terms of, that I got my doctorate at Bar Ilan, and I remain today, and I hope I'll always remain in the world of the Beit Midrash, right? So that for me, both I think Parshanut, but especially Midrash, it is a world that really, I think, deepens and enhances my understanding of Megillat Rut. And one of the things that I was trying to do, and I actually wrote a methodological introduction to the book because I wanted it to be clear what I was trying to do. One of the things that I try to do is take the rigor and the methodology that I learned in university and combine it with the inspiration and the depth of meaning that I've always found in the Midrash, and to emerge with this book. So, that's what I tried to do. That's what I hope that I was able to accomplish. But really, what I'm looking for are the deeper messages of Megillat Ruth that are both inspirational, meaningful, and that clarify Megillat Ruth's place within the broader story of Tanakh and the broader goals of Tanakh, the broader themes of Tanakh. And ultimately, of course, I mentioned this at the beginning, but it's worth mentioning also towards the end, which is, that we have this opportunity today in, the last 100 years to really think about what kind of society we are building as an autonomous society in the land of Israel for the first time in, 2000 years. And some of these messages, which again, they seem so mundane and maybe even so almost trivial, but they're messages, I think, that really have the power to make society better. Sometimes when I talk to really young kids about Megillat Ruth, I say, well, the goal of Megillat Ruth, like Boaz, is to see the name of the other person, which sometimes just means saying hello to a person by name, right? You pass someone in the street, you say hello to them by name, you meet someone, you try to remember their name. There's a remarkable midrash, which I think really sums up this idea. The midrash tells us, Shlosha dvarim gazru beitin shel mata, the beitin shel mala kiblu, right? The three things were decreed by an earthly court that were accepted by a heavenly court. And one of those three things was instituted by Boaz, and that was She'ilat Shem B'Shem Hashem, that you can ask after the welfare of your friend using the name of God. Remember when Boaz approaches the Kotzrim, he says, Hashem imachem, and they respond, Yivarecha Hashem. We're very careful about pronouncing Shem Hashem. And so what this midrash seems to be suggesting is that what is it that Boaz teaches us more than anything else? He teaches us that asking after your friend's welfare, that inquiring after your fellow person is so important to God that he's almost mochel al kvodo, right? He's mochel al shmo. He allows you to use Shem Hashem in asking after your friend's welfare, which I think is a remarkably simple but critical message, one that can be understood by all ages, in all contexts, but which really lies at the heart of creating a wonderful society.
And the last thing I'll ask you is, obviously it's your book and you'll recommend it to everybody, but would you recommend someone to pick this up to read it? Is it looking for a more in-depth analysis and reading of Rus? What would you recommend? What do you recommend?
Well, first of all, as I said, I think Megillat Ruth, the book, can appeal to many ages. One of the things that I tried to do was to keep my academic sources in footnotes. I don't know if you noticed when you saw the book, but I really don't put any academic sources in the body of the book for those people who want to further their understanding. It's there, it's in the footnotes, but really in the book itself, it's mostly parshanim, midrashim, and close readings of the story itself. I also tried to divide the book into shorter chapters so that each chapter could be read in its own right. You can open the book and look at a chapter that speaks to you. I assume many people are already familiar with the story, and that each chapter I tried to offer something, that is an insight into either a person or a connection with another story, or the way in which Megillat Ruth fits into some of the broader themes of Tanakh. So I don't think you have to, read all 500 pages in one sitting in order to read the book or learn the book, but you could really open it and I certainly would hope that some people are reading it from beginning to end, but I know it's also very daunting because, the most frequently asked question about the book is, how could you write 500 pages on a 4-chapter book in Tanakh? So I appreciate that could be a little bit daunting, but I do think also the chapters, many of them do read as independent, not all of them, but many of them read as independent chapters, especially for people who are already familiar with the book and even with some of the rabbinic readings of the book.
Absolutely. Yeah, I really enjoyed the short chapters, like I said, split up. So, okay. So with that, thank you once again for joining me.
Okay, I'll take the opportunity, first of all, to thank you very much for this conversation, and also to wish everybody a Chag Shavuot Sameach. And and there should be a lot of learning, not just of Megillat Rut, but also of Megillat Rut. Thank you for having me.